So before we move into talking about power dynamics, there's one other point that I want to make here when we're just at this high level definition place, which is that human beings are really wired for power. We are social creatures. We exist within the context of other human beings. We exist in extraordinarily nuanced and complex social structures, infrastructure just in general. Our lives have a lot of interplay between people who come from very different backgrounds, who come from very different positions, who have different desires and different levels and capacity to enact those desires. And that's something that we just pay attention to and are really strongly wired to be attentive about and to be responsive to. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Having power, having influence is not in and of itself something that's an inherently negative piece, because there are many instances that we'll get to in just a second where having power is something that everybody is on board with, and that's an okay piece. So when we're talking about power dynamics as a concept or as a phenomenon that we want to exert some intentionality or some control, over, then it's important to remember that the goal there isn't to eliminate power dynamics, but rather the goal is to be intentional about them so that the impact those power dynamics have on our environment or on ourselves or on other people is the impact that we and everybody else who's involved actually want them to have. So how can we use power dynamics to further our own or our shared goals, not impede them or override somebody else's needs by taking control ourselves? Make sense? Any questions? So that's what power is. Now, what do we mean when we say power dynamics? And power dynamics are very, very simply the kinds and levels of influence that power has on social interactions, right? So power in and of itself is that kind of state of being. And then a power dynamic is the interaction between different people who see one another as having more or less power than they do, depending on the situation or depending on their relationship. And we'll get to those two pieces in a second. So starting this bit out with a question, I would like to hear if anybody has some examples of where do you see power dynamics at play in your life? Like if we take this definition of power dynamics being that interplay between people who see themselves and others as having certain levels of power and those levels of power interacting in some way. How would you see that at play in your own life, whether that's work, family, friends, romance, whatever you like?
I think as a tutor and teacher, we have power dynamics at work every day in our interactions with those that we're instructing, as well as the dynamics between us and our colleagues and between us and the director of the organization.
How are those power dynamics different between you and your students, you and your colleagues, and you and the director? Like for you personally?
For me personally, working with the dynamics between me and my students, it is definitely a hierarchical relationship, but I'm trying to minimize that sense of I'm the one that has all of the information, and I try to engage in more of a reciprocal relationship with them because I am always learning from them as they are learning from me. But it is inherently a hierarchy where I exert the power and I'm creating the control in the space and the environment. And I'm setting the tone there, so to speak. Between colleagues, I would ask my other colleague to speak to this as well, who's here. But that's something where I think we are actively striving to maintain a sense of balance and equality, respect for others' position and expertise in their field, learning from each other and maintaining a real balance in that dynamic. And then with our director, we have more of a collegial relationship, but there are elements of needing to defer to the decisions of someone who exerts a different level of control in that hierarchical structure above us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Beth. Any other thoughts? Dana, do you want to weigh in as a colleague here who might have a similar or different perspective?
No, I think Beth summarized it very well. I think within the colleagues, there is a concept of power being knowledge that somebody has on a subject or a particular individual. And
Hmm.
we try to recognize that and seek access to that in a way that we can use it to move everybody forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Other thoughts, other examples of how power dynamics are like relevant to your own life? It can be work, can be family, anything you like.
I've got a family one. I've been working with my own family over the course of the past several weeks, trying to help them sort out what is honestly a pretty complex set of problems around finances and logistics and different parts of the family moving to different parts of the country and all of that. Um, and watching and participating in the power dynamics at play there is really interesting because they are all, well, most of them are at least chronologically adults, if not emotionally or behaviorally some of the time. And I come in as in a position where I am not part of that family unit on the day to day. And so I'm a little bit of an outsider, but still technically part of the family. And there's a lot of complex interplay that goes into that, and it fluctuates sometimes pretty rapidly depending on what the situation is. And it's just really interesting to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Motley. And that is actually an excellent lead in to our next slide, which is we're going to talk about sort of when we think about power dynamics, it's important to remember that power is not static at all. It is a constantly fluctuating and changing kind of dynamic that is really strongly dependent and reliant on and subject to a variety of kind of contributing factors or influencers that can change that dynamic, even within the context of a single conversation or a single facial expression. And so when we're talking about power dynamics, it's important to remember that power dynamics are both situational and relational. And so what we mean by situational is that the amount of power we have depends on the context of our environment. You know, what gives us power in one situation may not be as relevant in others. So Beth was talking about how in the course of her work, she engages in 3 very different kinds of power dynamic. And those dynamics are dependent on relationships, and we'll get to that piece in a second, but they're also dependent on situation. Because within the context of actively teaching a class, that hierarchical power dynamic between Beth and her students is going to be very, very strongly at play. But in maybe a morning meeting or hanging out with some students at lunch, then you don't necessarily have quite that same level of presence for that hierarchical power dynamic because you are outside the immediate context of a learning environment. For those of us at work, that can look like being on multiple teams and having a position of leadership on one team and being just a contributor or a collaborator on another team, maybe with the same people involved. And so that would be a place where it's not that relational component that we're getting to in just a second, but rather, depending on the context of which project you're working on, the amount of power that you might have to impact or influence that project or the direction that you're going or the tasks that you're doing is going to change because that dynamic is going to shift depending on what your role is within the context of that environment. On the relational side, the amount of power we have also depends on how we perceive our relationship to other people and how they perceive their relationship to us. And this is one where Motley's example of helping their family navigate a pretty complex sort of financial and logistical and geographic and emotional situation is one where they have a variety of pretty complex relationships with everybody who is involved. And those relationships are different by the person, and they are also different kind of by the situation and by that context. And so depending on what that relationship looks like, Motley has more or less ability to impact or influence those events. Being in a conversation with family members who really look up to them and know them very well and asks them to come and help is going to be a place where they'll probably have a little bit more power at minimum on that like social capital side of things. But engaging with the members of the family who don't know them very well or who are already a little bit hesitant about people being like in their business or something might be more resistant to the ways that Motley could influence that conversation, because that relationship is not one where they are willing to give Motley the ability to do that. Does that make sense? And any thoughts or questions on either that situational or that relational piece?
So Rachel, this is probably a little bit of an edge case to usual audiences, but I go back to my military experiences and currently do work with people in uniform. While there's certainly quite a bit of truth to the situational and relational, at least in those contexts, there's a very defined power dynamic that is independent of any of this. It's literally based on the rank on your shoulder. And it underpins the formal and informal engagements on a minute-to-minute, day-to-day in a way that you're always aware that you either outrank or of equal rank, and even if you're of equal rank or you're at the same seniority or lower rank of the person you're talking with. And interestingly, you would see those dynamics extend to spouses of people in uniform, and some would try to carry the rank and power of their spouse, and others were very cognizant to not do that, and that was always an interesting play.
Yeah, so there's a lot of really rich stuff in that, and because military environments are one of the most interesting places to really look at power dynamics, because they are so explicitly and rigidly hierarchical, and that hierarchy is given preference or is given credence over basically anything else when it comes like down to that bottom line. And I'm going to mix up all my metaphors, but at the end of the day, that power hierarchy and that rank delineation is absolutely crucial to the military functioning as it is designed. And on the one hand, when we look at that overarching dynamic setup there, pretty easy to say, yeah, this is a place where that situational and that relational component do not have as much influence, because it is so clearly and sort of universally defined that there isn't space within how that system is structured for those power dynamics to be different, especially when it comes to people who are interacting between ranks. If you're interacting with somebody who's a higher or lower rank than you. We're going to get to a bit about that in a minute, where we talk about that rigid hierarchical structure is only one flavor of power dynamic, and there are many other ways where power comes into play that are less formal but rather informal forms of power that are subject to that situational or that relational component. And because of the influence that they have, does also exert some influence on that rigid hierarchical structure. And I think that's something that you might actually resonate with fairly well if you think about any time that you've had to convince a commanding officer or a superior officer to do something that they didn't want to do, and you were successful in doing so. On the relational side, that piece that you mentioned about the spousal, the impact of a spouse who's kind of carrying that rank of their spouse, even if they are not enlisted themselves, then that's a big piece of how that relational component can come out, because that power dynamic there comes from the spouse's perception of their relationship to their spouse, not necessarily the other people they are engaging in, but they take on that's a similar feeling of power, or they assume a similar feeling of power because of their relationship to somebody who has that power. Any other thoughts, questions, ideas?
Yeah, I think it's I keyed in on the situational power things portion of it. Mostly in how things change and reveal lines of power that weren't readily apparent before. In my own experience, I had a good feeling about what power was and what power I had. I thought, from studying it for a number of semesters, and as I've transitioned and found my role at work specifically, but in the world really, to have changed from my perceived gender and things like this. In places that I didn't expect. I wasn't aware that I had the power that I had that I don't have as much anymore, or maybe a lessened amount of it. And that change in situation or change in perspective has been revealing to me, and seeing the kind of unseen power and unnoticed power.
Absolutely. So welcome Imogen. We have an additional participant today. Imogen has joined us as well. It's really lovely to have you here. And I really, really resonate with what you're saying there, because, that was actually the next discussion question I was going to ask, was about, it is possible to both believe that you have power when you don't, or to not believe that you have power when you do. And it sounds like that's something that you were just describing, as that experience as your kind of identity has changed and as your relationship to your surroundings and to other people has changed, you're getting some of that insight into the ways that power that you thought you had maybe wasn't as robust as it was, or feeling that sense of loss of power when you didn't even realize that you had it before, because it had never occurred to you to look for it or to notice the impact that it had. Has anybody else had a similar experience where they realized that they had more power than they thought they did, or that they had less than they thought they did?
Oh, for sure. When I first started doing victim advocacy work, I was very, very used to people just not taking me seriously at all. And then I got stuck in that frame of mind. And then when I started meeting people that I thought of as more powerful than me, who very clearly held themselves accountable to what I thought of them and their actions, it was an extraordinarily surprising sense of power, and continues to be in a lot of ways.
Yeah. There's that, sometimes you see people talk about the way that other people respond. If you just walk up to a complete stranger in the grocery store, maybe not right now because we're trying to be socially distant, but if you just walk up to a complete stranger in the grocery store and hand them maybe just like a box of cereal and say, here, take this, most people are going to take it. Right? They have no idea who you are. They have no idea why they ought to or ought not to listen to you, but simply the fact of being handed an imperative and a physical object, people will respond to that, and they will comply with whatever it is that you've asked for, whatever it is that you've told them to do. And that's not a particular kind of power that anybody decided or that anybody agreed on or that anybody even thinks about on purpose necessarily. All right, so we've got a couple of comments in the chat. I think harkening back to what David was saying about the power dynamics in that spouses of military members have, and how that also extends to their children and other dependents. And I can see Beth saying that perceived rank can absolutely carry through other dependence relationships. And that's something that's real easy to see just in the difference between children who grew up with officers for parents or children that grew up with enlisted service members for parents, and the ways that they talk about their experiences differently, and how those interactions can be potentially quite challenging because of that perceived feeling of power or lack thereof that comes from the association with other power. Absolutely. So doing all of that, let's go ahead and talk about a couple of examples of power dynamics that are, some of them are going to be a little bit obvious and some of them are going to be maybe a little bit weird. But, like I said, that human beings are wired for power component. That means that we find power dynamics absolutely everywhere. They happen anywhere that people interact, and they might be only slightly influential on the situation, or they might be extraordinarily influential on the situation, depending. Sometimes they're pretty obvious, sometimes they're really subtle, but just like learning to recognize any kind of new thing or starting to think about it, as soon as you start to look for power dynamics, you're going to find them everywhere. This is something that I tell people in my microaggressions classes as well. When you start to look for all of the tiny ways that people hurt each other without even noticing, you start to see them everywhere. And it's the same thing with power dynamics. As soon as you start to think about power dynamics with that name around it and with that context to be able to identify it, you'll see them in the tiniest of places and in the biggest of places. So for today's purposes, there's obviously literally no way we can talk through all of them or even hope to categorize or identify all of them, but I wanted to call out a few different ones, and there are 4 different categories that I think are particularly interesting or illustrative of the diversity of ways that power dynamics influence us or kind of show up in our interactions. And the first one there that's really, really, really huge is information. And this is something that we are seeing in a variety of ways right now, both in the workplace and also just more culturally and politically, all of these different pieces. But having access to or control over information is the expression of a power dynamic, because being able to control what information other people see is a way of controlling their knowledge, right? It's controlling what information they have access to, which is going to influence the beliefs that they have, or influence their opinions, or the decisions that they make, or the behaviors that they engage. One of my favorite examples for power dynamics is note-taking, in particular note-taking in meetings, because it is a really fun example of both having and lacking power at exactly the same time. When you are taking notes in a meeting, on the one hand, within the context, like the present context of that meeting, you are sacrificing or losing a fair amount of power, because your role in that conversation is to be a passive recorder of what other people are saying, which means your priority is going to be writing down other people's thoughts, other people's opinions, or decisions that others are making. And that leaves you less time to submit your own ideas or your own thoughts or your own opinions. And while you are focused on taking notes, the conversation is going to continue moving forward. And so you have less opportunity to exert your own influence, because you have less opportunity to actively participate at all. On the other hand, you are taking notes for the meeting, which means you are recording the events of that meeting. And what you do or do not choose to write down is going to serve as the record of what was discussed or decided in that meeting, or in that conversation. And that is an enormous amount of power, not necessarily in that present moment, but in terms of the way that that meeting has the potential to influence future events. You have an enormous amount of power to control that by limiting or expanding on or fabricating or omitting information that was discussed in that meeting, or decisions that were made, or reasons and context behind those decisions. Data visualization is another place where there is an enormous amount of power that occurs between whoever is creating that visual, that data visualization piece, whether that's a chart or an infographic or a graph or a map, anything that is a visual representation of information and data, and the people who are receiving that visualization or who are viewing that graphic. Because the ways that we choose to organize data, the information that we do or do not include in a graph, the colors that we use, the font that we use, the ways that we do or do not label things, how clear or how muddy and obscure we make that data, how easy to understand or how challenging, or what it does or does not focus on or prioritize, are all ways of controlling a narrative and controlling the information that others have access to, that they are presumably going to be making decisions or acting on. And that leads to that third point under information about narrative setting, and how controlling a narrative or offering a narrative, especially one that is in conflict or contradictory with a different narrative, is a enormously effective way of engaging a power dynamic, or a particularly salient example of where power dynamics happen. We operate off of stories, right? We tell stories to each other. We tell stories in our own heads. We're always looking for that narrative flow to see how distinct pieces of information or events are connected to each other, and what do those connections mean. So if I am telling you a story about a time that I was crossing the street and a car almost hit me, and I want you to feel bad for me for almost being hit by that car, I'm going to tell you things like, I was crossing the street, I had my arms full of groceries, I had a kid behind me who I was trying to keep track of, and this red car came flying down the road and blared its horn at me, and it was only because I jumped out of the way and pushed my kid out of the way that I didn't get hit. Then that story, the way that I told that narrative, makes it sound like I did nothing wrong, and it was completely out of my control that happened. But if instead I tell that story and I talk about how I looked both ways before I decided I was going to cross the street, and I decided that that car was going to stop, and if it didn't stop, it was going to hit me, but because I was a pedestrian, I was going to decide to cross that street, and the car was going to stop in front of me, or stop before it hit me, because that was its responsibility. And when the car didn't stop, then I had to jump back out of the way. Now, that's a very different story that casts me in a very different light, maybe as somebody who doesn't make the smartest or safest decisions when it comes to assessing my own safety and the safety of the children who are in my care. But if I don't want you to feel that way about me, then I'm not going to tell you those pieces of information. And by controlling that narrative, I control, and I can at minimum exert influence over your beliefs about how that story went and who I am, who you think I am as a result of it. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any other thoughts or examples of ways that information can create or supplement power dynamics between people?
I want to kind of play off of your example a little bit, mostly because I see a very different narrative in the second way you told that story. And I think it's interesting to look at the different interpretations in the ways that we set narratives. And the second way you told that story, what I heard from what you described was not that you had additional responsibility or culpability there. It was that the car was even more irresponsible. Because what I got out of that was not you as a person who barely avoided being run over had done an irresponsible thing in choosing to cross the street. I heard that you made a decision on purpose, decided that you were going to trust that that car was going to engage responsibly and follow traffic laws, and then acted accordingly. And that to me doesn't involve any extra culpability. And I think that interpretation is interesting.
And that's a really great example of when we talk about narrative and controlling a narrative being an example of a power dynamic, that's not necessarily a universal power dynamic, because the way I tell a story is not always going to be the way that you hear a story or the way that somebody else hears a story. And so there's a limit to how much influence I have on your beliefs simply through the power of narrative and limiting or providing particular pieces of data, because it is always going to be subject to and filtered through your own interpretation. So moving to one of our other pieces here. I don't know if we're going to go through all four, but I think maybe we can talk about support. Because support is another place here that has a really, really strong influence on power dynamics. And what I mean by support is what level of backing or power you have behind you that facilitates or condones or endorses your expression of power within a particular dynamic. And so when we talk about this as a systemic piece. We talk about it within the terms of social capital. So just how much other people want to listen to you or seek your good opinion, not because you are formally in charge, but because you are well liked or well regarded or feared. And then also formal authority, in terms of whether or not you are formally or explicitly in charge and what backing you have for that formal authority. So this is a place where we can go back to David's example about the military, because the power that comes through having rank in the military is power that is only effective because it is backed by the larger system and structure of the military, which has created that hierarchical system and enforces it by exerting even more control or power over people who challenge it, right? So if you disobey orders, then you might be discharged. And being discharged is an expression of power because you are then removed from the dynamic completely for failing to comply with the hierarchy of power, there we go, that has already been clearly described within which you are a member. We also see this at a systemic level where we're talking, and when I mean systemic, I mean something that is embedded in larger political systems, larger social or cultural systems that make up the ways that we as a community, whether it's a local community or a national community, operate and interact with each other. And so this is a place where we bring in concepts like racism or concepts like sexism, because the systems of power in our country, like our political systems, our government, our infrastructure, all of those different components, are systems that were designed, implemented, and continue to be executed in ways that disproportionately affect people of different identities, in particular people of different races. Like America was designed to empower and support white people, and it was designed to disempower and oppress people of color, in particular Black people. And the ways that our systems have been designed reflect that. So when we are in a position where we are engaging with members of another race, if we are white, then we have the backing of an entire like national system or structure or web of systems and history that is more likely to support us in the decisions that we make than they are to support a person of color, in particular a Black person.